working as a cook at the wedding buffet. The woman froze when she saw the millionaire groom in the kitchen. It was her husband, who she believed was dead. She ran to the hall, and the crystal chandelier above Rachel Morgan's head cast dancing shadows across the pristine marble floor of the Rosemont Grand Hotel's kitchen. At 32, she'd learned to navigate the chaos of high-end catering like a seasoned captain steering through a storm. Her calloused hands moved with practiced precision, arranging delicate canapés on silver platters that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Rachel, table 12 needs the caviar service in 5 minutes," called Marcus, the head waiter, his voice cutting through the symphony of sizzling pans and chopping knives. "On it," she replied, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The kitchen was a furnace of activity, preparing for what the society pages were calling the wedding of the century, $800,000 for a single event. Rachel had seen the guest list: senators, tech moguls, old money families whose names graced museum wings and hospital foundations. She glanced at the clock. 4:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, 400 of New York's elite would witness the union of Ethan Sinclair and Isabelle Thornton. Rachel had been working events like this for 3 years now, ever since her world had crumbled into 1,000 pieces. "Don't think about it," she told herself. The same mantra she'd repeated countless times. Focus on the work. Focus on Sophie. But memories had a way of creeping in during quiet moments. The phone call that changed everything. Detective Morrison's voice, carefully neutral. "Mrs. Lawson, we found your husband's car in the river near Evergreen Crossing Bridge. I'm sorry, but we need you to come down and identify some personal effects. David's wallet, waterlogged but intact. His wedding ring, still gleaming despite the murky river water. His favorite watch, the one she'd given him for their 5th anniversary, stopped at 11:43 p.m. The storm that night had been biblical. Sheets of rain that made driving treacherous. Winds that bent trees like blades of grass. Presumed dead, the official report had stated. No body recovered. Case closed. 3.5 years of grieving. 3.5 years of explaining to 8-year-old Sophie why Daddy wasn't coming home. 3.5 years of struggling to pay bills that David had left behind. Debts she'd never known existed. "Chef Morgan, the Thornton family wants to compliment the appetizers," Marcus said, startling her from her reverie. "They're asking if you can prepare something special for the bride's table." Rachel nodded, grateful for the distraction. She'd taken this job because the payment would finally allow her to catch up on the mortgage, and maybe, just maybe, enroll Sophie in that private school she'd been eyeing. The one with the art program that would make her daughter's eyes light up the way they used to before David died. The kitchen doors swung open, and she could hear the gentle murmur of conversation from the reception hall. Champagne flutes clinked together in toasts, and someone was playing Mozart on what sounded like a very expensive piano. This was a world Rachel catered to but never belonged in. A world where problems were solved with money and connections, not with 16-hour workdays and prayers that the car wouldn't break down. She began arranging the final touches on the bride's special platter. Tiny quiches with truffle oil, salmon rosettes with dill cream, and those impossibly delicate pastries that took her 2 hours to perfect. Each piece was a work of art, designed to impress people who expected perfection as their birthright. As she worked, Rachel's mind wandered to Sophie, who was spending the weekend with her best friend Emma. Tomorrow, they'd planned to visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a free activity that had become their monthly tradition. Sophie loved the Egyptian wing, fascinated by the stories of pharaohs and ancient mysteries. "Mommy," she'd said last week, "do you think Daddy can see the pyramids from heaven?" The question had nearly broken Rachel's heart. Sophie still talked about David as if he might walk through the door at any moment. 3 years later, Dr. Patterson, the school counselor, said it was normal for children to hold on to hope longer than adults. But Rachel worried that Sophie's inability to let go was somehow her fault, that she hadn't been strong enough to help her daughter process the loss. "Behind you, hot," called James, one of the line cooks, carrying a tray of bacon-wrapped scallops fresh from the oven. The kitchen was reaching its peak frenzy now, with servers rushing in and out, grabbing platters and returning with empty ones. Rachel picked up the bride's special platter, checking each piece one final time. Everything had to be perfect. The Thornton family hadn't become one of America's wealthiest dynasties by accepting mediocrity. Richard Thornton's business empire spanned from tech investments to real estate, and his only daughter's wedding was being treated with the same attention to detail as a state dinner. She pushed through the swing doors into the reception hall, and the contrast hit her immediately, where the kitchen was all efficiency and chaos. The reception hall was a monument to elegance. Thousands of white roses cascaded from every surface, their perfume mixing with the subtle scent of expensive perfume and cigars. The guests moved like graceful dancers, their conversations a carefully orchestrated ballet of networking and social positioning. Rachel made her way toward the bride's table, keeping her head down and her movements purposeful. She'd learned to become invisible in spaces like this, present enough to do her job. Invisible enough to avoid uncomfortable questions about why a woman her age was working catering instead of attending as a guest. The bride's table was positioned on a raised platform, giving Isabelle Thornton, soon-to-be Sinclair, a perfect view of her assembled guests. She was breathtaking in the way that only young women with unlimited resources could be. Her dress alone probably cost more than Rachel's annual salary, but there was something genuinely sweet about her smile, something that suggested she hadn't been completely corrupted by wealth. As Rachel approached the table, she could hear the groomsmen laughing about something, their voices carrying over the classical music. One of them was telling a story about a business deal gone wrong, and the others were responding with the kind of laughter that spoke of shared experiences and old friendships. So, there I was, thinking I'd lost everything, one of the men was saying, his voice rich with amusement. But sometimes you've got to take a leap of faith, start over completely. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is getting a chance to reinvent yourself. Rachel's hands began to tremble. That voice, she knew that voice better than her own heartbeat. She'd heard it whisper, "I love you," on their wedding night. She'd heard it reading bedtime stories to Sophie. She'd heard it in her dreams for 3.5 years. The silver platter slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing to the marble floor with a sound like breaking thunder. 400 heads turned toward the noise. But Rachel barely noticed. Her eyes were locked on the man in the $50,000 tuxedo, the man who was supposed to be dead. The man who was laughing with his groomsmen as if he hadn't destroyed 2 lives when he'd driven his car into that river. David Lawson, her husband, Sophie's father, the man she'd mourned for 3.5 years, was standing 15 feet away, wearing another man's name and about to marry another woman. The world tilted, and Rachel had to grab the edge of a chair to keep from falling. David's eyes met hers across the reception hall, and she watched his face drain of color. His mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Time seemed suspended, crystallized in that moment of recognition. The classical music continued to play. The guests continued their conversations. But for Rachel, the universe had narrowed to the space between her and the ghost who had just ruined her life all over again. The crash of the silver platter still echoed in Rachel's ears as she stood frozen, staring at the impossible. David, her dead husband, was looking back at her with the expression of a man who'd seen his own ghost. Around them, the wedding reception continued its elegant dance, but Rachel felt as if she were watching it all from underwater. "Ma'am, are you all right?" A server appeared at her elbow, already kneeling to collect the scattered canapés from the marble floor. The concern in his voice barely registered through the roaring in Rachel's head. Yes, I'm fine," she managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Just clumsy, but she wasn't fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. David had turned away from her, his face pale beneath his perfectly styled hair, and was saying something to the groomsmen beside him. She watched his lips move, saw him gesture toward the kitchen doors, and suddenly Rachel understood. He was going to run. Again. Not this time. Her legs felt like jelly as she forced herself to move. Weaving through the clusters of guests who were already returning their attention to champagne and conversation, the brief disruption of a dropped tray was hardly noteworthy in their world of practiced social grace. Rachel kept her eyes locked on David as he excused himself from the group, heading toward a corridor that led to the hotel's private meeting rooms. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she followed, maintaining enough distance to avoid drawing attention, but close enough to ensure he couldn't disappear again. The corridor was mercifully empty, lined with oil paintings of New York landmarks and softly lit by brass sconces that cast warm pools of light across the burgundy carpet. David stopped near a door marked Wellington Conference Room and turned to face her. Up close, he looked older than his 34 years. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his dark hair showed the first hints of silver at the temples, but it was definitely him, the man she'd married, the man she'd buried in her heart. Rachel, her name came out as barely a whisper, as if speaking it too loudly might shatter whatever spell was keeping them both upright. Don't, the word ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. Don't you dare say my name like you have any right to it. He glanced nervously toward the reception hall, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're making a mistake. I think you have me confused with someone else. The casual lie hit her like a physical blow. After everything, after the funeral she'd planned, after the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, after watching Sophie ask Santa Claus to bring her daddy home, he was going to stand there and pretend he didn't know her. A mistake. Rachel's voice cracked. David Michael Lawson, born June 15, 1990 in Portland, Oregon. Your mother's maiden name was Catherine Price. You have a scar on your left shoulder from when you fell off your bike when you were 7. You're allergic to shellfish. You hate mushrooms. And you used to sing Rainbow Connection to Sophie every night before bed. With each detail, she watched his carefully constructed facade crumble. His shoulders sagged, and he looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. You can't be here, he said finally, abandoning the pretense. This isn't how this was supposed to happen. How what was supposed to happen? Rachel stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne. Different from what he used to wear, more expensive. Your wedding, to that sweet girl who has no idea she's about to marry a dead man. It's complicated, Rachel. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. The words burst out louder than she'd intended, and David flinched, glancing toward the reception hall again. Explain to me how my husband, who died in a car accident 3.5 years ago, is standing here in a tuxedo about to marry someone else. Explain to me how I identified your personal effects at the morgue. Explain to me how I've been paying off debts you left behind while you've been playing house with a billionaire's daughter. David's face cycled through a dozen emotions. Guilt, fear, something that might have been regret. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost broken. I had no choice, Rach. You have to believe that. I was in deep with some very dangerous people. The kind of people who don't just hurt you. They hurt everyone you love. What are you talking about? But even as she asked, pieces began clicking into place. The mysterious late-night phone calls in the months before his death, the way he'd been checking the locks obsessively, jumping at unexpected sounds, the tension that had settled over their marriage like a heavy blanket. I made some mistakes at work, David continued, his eyes darting around the empty corridor. I borrowed money from the company accounts, just temporarily. I swear I was trying to invest it, make enough to pay it back with interest. But the deals went bad, and then the auditors started sniffing around. Rachel stared at him, the man she'd thought she knew better than anyone. You embezzled money. I was going to pay it back. But then these guys, these loan sharks I'd borrowed from to cover the initial losses, they started making threats. They knew where we lived, Rachel. They knew Sophie's school schedule. The mention of their daughter's name sent a fresh wave of rage through Rachel's system. So you faked your death. You let us think you were gone forever, rather than face the consequences of your choices. I did it to protect you. David's voice rose, then dropped again as he remembered where they were. Don't you see? If they thought I was dead, they'd leave you and Sophie alone. I staged the accident, made it look like I'd crashed during the storm. It was the only way. And the money, the debts I've been drowning in for 3 years. David's silence was answer enough. The personal loans, the credit card debt, the second mortgage on their house that she'd discovered after his death, all of it had been real. All of it had been hers to deal with while he'd been building a new life as Ethan Sinclair. How much did you steal, David? $6 million, he whispered. But I've been paying it back. The Sinclair identity, the business I built. It's all been about making enough money to eventually... $6 million. Rachel felt dizzy. You stole $6 million, faked your death, and left me to clean up the mess while you courted a rich girl. It wasn't like that. I never meant for it to go this far. When I met Isabelle, I thought maybe I could use her father's connections to legitimize the business, make everything right. But then she fell in love with Ethan, and her father approved of the match, and I couldn't figure out how to extract myself without destroying everything. So you decided to marry her. The words tasted like poison in Rachel's mouth. I was going to tell her the truth eventually, after we were married. After I had access to enough resources to pay everyone back and disappear again, I thought I could set you and Sophie up with enough money to be comfortable for life. Rachel stared at him, this stranger wearing her husband's face. You were never coming back, were you? Even if none of this had happened, even if you'd successfully pulled off your grand plan, you were never coming home to us. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sound of laughter from the reception hall. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I couldn't. Too much had changed. I'd changed, and you and Sophie deserved better than what I'd become. The truth of it hit Rachel like a slap. He'd chosen this. Not just the embezzlement, not just the faked death, but the abandonment. He'd chosen to let them grieve, to let Sophie grow up thinking her father was dead, because it was easier than facing what he'd done. That girl in there, Rachel said, her voice steady now, cold as winter. Does she know what kind of man she's about to marry? David's eyes pleaded with her. Rachel, please, if you expose me now, it won't just destroy my life, it'll destroy hers too. She's innocent in all this. So was Sophie when you decided to play dead. Rachel turned toward the reception hall, her decision crystallizing. So was I. Rachel, wait. But she was already walking away, her mind racing with the magnitude of what she had to do. Behind her, she heard David call her name once more, but she didn't turn around. She had a wedding to stop and a truth to tell, no matter how many lives it shattered in the process. The ghost of her past was about to become everyone else's nightmare. 3 months earlier, Isabelle Thornton had been certain that fairy tales were just stories told to little girls who didn't understand how the real world worked. At 24, she'd watched enough of her friends marry for money, status, or family connections to know that true love was a luxury most people in her social circle couldn't afford. Then she'd met Ethan Sinclair at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual charity gala. Now, as she stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Rosemont Grand Hotel, Isabelle touched the diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The woman looking back at her seemed almost too perfect to be real. The Vera Wang gown that had taken 6 months to design, the delicate tiara that caught the afternoon light like captured stars, the subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked her natural beauty. You look absolutely radiant, darling, her mother, Patricia Thornton, said from the velvet chair where she'd been supervising the final preparations. At 52, Patricia remained a force of nature in Manhattan society circles. Her opinion capable of making or breaking social reputations. Her approval of Ethan had been crucial in Richard's acceptance of the match. I can't believe this is really happening, Isabelle murmured, smoothing the silk of her dress. Sometimes I feel like I'm going to wake up and discover it was all a dream. Her maid of honor, Catherine Hamilton, laughed from where she was adjusting her own bridesmaid dress. Trust me, Belle. This is as real as it gets. $800,000 for a wedding doesn't happen in dreams, unless they're really expensive dreams. Isabelle had known Catherine since childhood, and she was one of the few people who could get away with teasing her about the wedding's extravagance. The guest list read like a who's who of American power brokers, senators, tech moguls, old money families whose names graced museum wings and university buildings. It was exactly the kind of event the Thornton family was expected to host for their only daughter's wedding. Tell me about the moment you knew, Catherine said, settling onto the chaise lounge with a glass of champagne. The exact moment you realized Ethan was the one. Isabelle's face softened as she remembered. It was at the Frick Collection benefit. I was hiding in the garden because Senator Morrison's wife had cornered me again about her son's promising political career. You know how she gets. Patricia rolled her eyes. That woman has been trying to marry her boy off to every eligible heiress on the East Coast, as if political ambition were an attractive quality in a husband. Anyway, Isabelle continued, I was sitting on that little bench by the fountain, and this man sat down next to me. I was ready to give him the polite brush-off I'd perfected, but then he said, You look like you'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. And he was right, Catherine prompted. Completely. We ended up talking for 2 hours about everything except the usual society nonsense. He told me about his business ventures, his plans to expand into sustainable technology. But more than that, he listened when I talked about my art history degree, my dream of opening a gallery that showcased emerging artists instead of just the same old masters. What Isabelle didn't know was that David Lawson had spent 6 weeks researching her interests before that carefully orchestrated chance encounter. He'd studied her college transcripts, her published papers on contemporary art, even her social media posts about exhibitions she'd attended. Every word of their conversation had been calculated to appeal to the woman he'd identified as his pathway to legitimacy and financial security. He made me feel like my opinions mattered, Isabelle said, her voice growing dreamy. Like I was more than just Richard Thornton's daughter, or a potential addition to someone's social portfolio. And when did you introduce him to father? Patricia asked, though she already knew the answer. Richard's approval had been swift and decisive once his private investigators had confirmed Ethan Sinclair's business credentials and financial standing. 2 weeks later, at the Met's opening of the Egyptian wing renovation, Ethan fit right in, didn't he? Daddy was impressed with his knowledge of international markets, and Mother loved his stories about art collecting in Europe. What the Thorntons' investigators had found was exactly what David had spent 6 months and considerable money creating: a flawless background for Ethan Sinclair. The business records were real, filed with all the appropriate government agencies. The bank accounts contained genuine funds, laundered through a series of shell companies and investment vehicles. The references checked out because David had paid handsomely for their testimonials. The only thing missing was a past that extended more than 18 months back. But wealthy entrepreneurs were often eccentric about their privacy. Richard Thornton's team had encountered similar opacity with other successful businessmen, who preferred to keep their early ventures confidential for competitive reasons. I still remember the first time he kissed me, Isabelle said, touching her lips unconsciously. We were walking through Central Park after the Philharmonic concert, and it started raining. We took shelter under that old bridge near the lake, and he just looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Catherine sighed dramatically. God, that's romantic. Most of the men in our circle would have been worried about their Italian leather shoes getting wet. That's what I love about Ethan, Isabelle said, turning back to the mirror to check her lipstick one final time. He's successful and sophisticated, but he hasn't forgotten how to be spontaneous, how to be real. The irony was devastating. David Lawson had become so skilled at playing Ethan Sinclair that even he sometimes forgot where the performance ended and reality began. The man who had abandoned his wife and daughter had convinced himself that he could genuinely love this sweet, trusting young woman who saw only the best in everyone she met. Speaking of your charming fiancé, Patricia said, glancing at her diamond watch. The ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Are you ready, darling? Isabelle took one last look at herself in the mirror, checking every detail of her appearance. The dress was perfect, the makeup flawless, the flowers arranged just so. In 20 minutes, she would walk down the aisle of the most beautiful reception hall in Manhattan and promise to spend the rest of her life with a man who made her believe in fairy tales again. I'm ready, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. Miss Thornton, called a voice from the hallway. Your father is here to escort you downstairs. Richard Thornton entered the bridal suite, wearing the expression of a man who was about to give away his most precious possession. At 60, he remained an imposing figure despite the silver that had crept into his dark hair. Building a business empire worth $12 billion had required a combination of ruthless intelligence and careful judgment, qualities that had served him well in evaluating his daughter's suitors. My beautiful girl, he said, his voice thick with emotion as he took in the sight of Isabelle in her wedding dress. You look exactly like your grandmother did on her wedding day. Oh, Daddy, Isabelle said, tears threatening to ruin her carefully applied mascara. Please don't make me cry before the ceremony. I won't, Richard promised, though his own eyes were suspiciously bright. I just want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I believe you've chosen well. Ethan is exactly the kind of man I'd hoped you'd find. Someone who sees your worth beyond the family name and fortune. If Richard had any lingering doubts about his future son-in-law, he'd buried them beneath the evidence his investigators had compiled. Ethan Sinclair was everything he appeared to be. Successful, ambitious, and genuinely devoted to Isabelle. The prenuptial agreement had been negotiated fairly, with Ethan actually refusing several provisions that would have been financially advantageous to him. "He makes me happy, Daddy," Isabelle said simply. "For the first time in my life, I feel like someone chose me for me." "Not for what I represent. That's all any father can ask for," Richard replied, offering his arm. "Shall we go make this official?" As they prepared to leave the bridal suite, Isabelle caught sight of herself in the mirror one more time. In a few minutes, she would be Mrs. Ethan Sinclair, starting a new life with the man she loved more than she'd ever thought possible. She had no way of knowing that downstairs in the reception hall, her perfect world was about to shatter into a million pieces. The fairy tale she'd believed in so completely was built on lies so elaborate and cruel that when the truth finally emerged, it would destroy not just her wedding day, but her faith in her ability to judge human character. The ghost of Ethan Sinclair's past was already walking through the hotel, and soon everyone would learn that some dead men tell tales after all. The wedding march began its stately progression through the reception hall as 400 of New York's elite rose to their feet. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from the massive chandelier, and the air was perfumed with thousands of white roses that had been flown in from Ecuador that morning. Every detail was perfect, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the 18-piece orchestra positioned discreetly in the alcove. Rachel stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her hands still trembling from her confrontation with David. Through the service window, she could see him at the altar, magnificent in his custom tuxedo, playing the role of devoted groom with the same skill he'd once used to convince her he was a loving husband. The officiant, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled benevolently as the processional music swelled. Isabelle appeared at the far end of the aisle, radiant on her father's arm. Her dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than Rachel's annual salary, and her face glowed with the happiness of a woman who believed she was about to marry her soulmate. The assembled guests murmured appreciatively at her beauty, phones discreetly capturing moments for social media posts that would make the society pages tomorrow. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's excellent acoustics. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ethan Sinclair and Isabelle Thornton in holy matrimony." Rachel's vision blurred with rage. Ethan Sinclair. Even his fake name was a lie built on lies. While she'd been working double shifts to pay off the debts he'd left behind, while she'd been explaining to Sophie why Daddy would never come home, he'd been building this elaborate fantasy life with someone else's identity and someone else's money. She thought of the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, the mornings she'd woken up hoping for just a moment that his death had been a nightmare. She thought of Sophie's 8th birthday, when her daughter had wished on her candles for her daddy to come back. She thought of the life insurance claim that had been denied because no body was ever found, leaving them with nothing but debt and heartbreak. "If anyone has reason why these two should not be joined in marriage," the officiant continued, following the traditional script, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The words hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment. Rachel could walk away. Let David have his new life. Protect Isabelle from the devastating truth. She could return to the kitchen, finish her shift, and pretend she'd never seen the ghost of her dead husband about to commit bigamy with a billionaire's daughter. But then she thought of Sophie again. Sweet, trusting Sophie, who still set a place for Daddy at Christmas dinner, who still asked why God had taken him away. Her daughter deserved better than a father who had chosen to abandon her, and Isabelle deserved better than a marriage built on the bones of David's victims. Rachel stepped into the reception hall. "I do," she said, her voice cutting through the expectant silence like a blade. 400 heads turned toward her, confusion rippling through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. She was aware of how she must look. A woman in a catering uniform, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, standing among Manhattan's elite like a wolf among sheep. David's face had gone white as parchment. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and Rachel could see his hands shaking as he gripped his wedding program. "I'm sorry," the officiant said gently, clearly assuming this was some sort of mistake. "Are you? This man is a fraud." Rachel's voice rang out, clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the reception hall. "His name isn't Ethan Sinclair, it's David Lawson, and he's my husband." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the hall. Champagne glasses were set down with sharp clinks, and conversations erupted in urgent whispers. Isabelle's bouquet slipped from her nerveless fingers, white roses scattering across the marble floor like fallen snow. Security. Richard Thornton's voice boomed from the front row, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. Remove this woman immediately. But Rachel was already moving forward, pulling something from her apron pocket. His real name is David Michael Lawson, she continued, her voice never wavering. We were married 8 years ago at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We have a daughter together, Sophie. She's 8 years old, and she thinks her father is dead. You're clearly disturbed. David finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. I don't know who you are, but don't. Rachel's voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare lie to these people the way you lied to me. She held up a small silver frame, their wedding photo, the one she'd carried in her apron as a reminder of happier times. This is us on our wedding day, and this... She pulled out a birth certificate. This is our daughter's birth certificate. David Michael Lawson, listed as the father. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Someone was recording with their phone, and Rachel realized this moment would be splashed across social media within minutes. But she didn't care anymore. The truth was more important than her privacy. Isabelle had gone deathly pale, swaying on her feet as if she might faint. Her bridesmaids moved to support her, their own faces reflecting shock and confusion. Daddy, Isabelle's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the sudden hush that had fallen over the hall. Is this true? Richard Thornton looked like a man who'd been punched in the stomach. His investigators had been thorough, meticulous even, but they'd been investigating Ethan Sinclair, a man who had never existed before David Lawson created him. This is impossible, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. We had him thoroughly investigated. His background checks out completely. Because he spent months and millions of dollars creating that background, Rachel said, turning to address the assembled guests. 3.5 years ago, David Lawson stole $6 million from his employer and faked his own death to escape the consequences. I identified his personal effects at the morgue. I planned his funeral. I've been raising our daughter alone, thinking she was an orphan. She reached into her pocket again and pulled out a small object that glinted in the chandelier light. And this is his wedding ring, the one I thought was lost in the river, the one he's been wearing on a chain around his neck under his shirts. David's hand went instinctively to his chest, confirming what everyone now suspected. The gesture was small, but in the utter silence of the reception hall, it was as damning as a signed confession. Detective Mark Sullivan, who had been attending as a guest of the Thornton family, stepped forward from the crowd. Rachel recognized him from news reports about financial crimes, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed what he was hearing. Ma'am, he said quietly, his tone professional but kind. I'm Detective Sullivan with the NYPD. Are you saying this man faked his own death and is now committing identity fraud? Yes, Rachel said simply. And bigamy, since he's still legally married to me. The word bigamy sent another shockwave through the crowd. In their world of prenuptial agreements and society marriages, the idea of such a crude deception was almost unthinkable. Isabelle made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed into her father's arms. The bridesmaids surrounded her, their own faces pale with shock. The fairy tale wedding had become a nightmare in the space of 5 minutes. This is preposterous, David said, but his voice was hollow now, the fight going out of him as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. I can prove who I am. I have documents, business records, documents you paid for, Detective Sullivan said, stepping closer. Mr. Lawson. And it is Lawson, isn't it? I've been investigating financial irregularities connected to your supposed death. There were questions about the Horizon Urban Group embezzlement that were never fully resolved. The detective's words hit David like physical blows. His carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time, broadcast to 400 of the most influential people in America. Isabelle, David said desperately, turning to his bride. Please let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. But Isabelle was beyond hearing him. She was sobbing now. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, the sound echoing off the marble walls like the cry of a lost child. Her wedding day, which should have been the happiest of her life, had become a public humiliation that would follow her forever. Rachel felt a moment of sympathy for the younger woman, but it was quickly overwhelmed by her own sense of justice finally being served. For 3.5 years, She had suffered in silence. Now it was David's turn to face the consequences of his choices. "The Evergreen Crossing Bridge," she said, her voice cutting through Isabelle's sobs. "That's where you supposedly died. But you were never in that car, were you, David? You just made it look that way." David's silence was answer enough. The truth hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone and impossible to deny. The wedding of the century had become the scandal of the decade, and Rachel Morgan, the wronged widow who refused to stay silent, stood at the center of it all. Finally free to speak the truth that had been burning inside her for 3.5 years, the reception hall had transformed from a celebration into a crime scene in the span of 10 minutes. Detective Mark Sullivan had taken control of the situation with the efficiency of a man who'd handled his share of white-collar disasters. Cordoning off the altar area and requesting that guests remain seated while he conducted preliminary interviews, Rachel found herself in the Wellington conference room, the same hallway where she'd confronted David earlier, now serving as an impromptu interrogation room through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She could see news vans already gathering outside the hotel, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. "Mrs. Lawson," Detective Sullivan said, settling into the chair across from her with a notepad and recorder. "I need you to walk me through everything you know about your husband's supposed death and the events leading up to it." Rachel's hands were steadier now, the shock of the confrontation giving way to a strange sense of relief. After 3.5 years of carrying this weight alone, finally having someone believe her felt like being able to breathe again. "David worked as a senior accountant for Horizon Urban Group," she began, her voice clear and measured. "In the months before his death, he'd been coming home late, taking calls at strange hours. He said it was just a busy period, year-end audits and such. I didn't think much of it at first." Detective Sullivan nodded, making notes. "When did you first notice something was wrong?" "About 6 weeks before the accident. He started getting nervous about everything. He'd check the locks 3 times before bed, jump when the phone rang. He said he was stressed about work, but it seemed like more than that. Then there were the credit cards." "What about them?" Rachel pulled out her phone, scrolling to photos she'd taken of financial documents years ago. "After he died, I discovered he'd taken out cash advances on cards I didn't even know existed. Nearly $40,000 in debt that I'm still paying off. When I asked the bank about it, they said the applications were all legitimate, signed in his handwriting." "Did you ever confront him about the financial irregularities while he was alive?" "I tried. The week before he died, he got angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen him. Said I didn't understand the pressure he was under, that everything would be fine if I just trusted him." Rachel's voice caught slightly. "The last thing we did was fight about money. I told him I was scared, that something felt wrong. He said he was handling it." Detective Sullivan's expression grew grim. "Mrs. Lawson, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until we can verify everything." "Understood." When Rachel nodded, he continued, "We've had an open file on Horizon Urban Group for 2 years. There were discrepancies in their books that suggested systematic embezzlement, but we could never trace it to a specific individual. When David Lawson supposedly died, the trail went cold. How much money are we talking about? Based on what you've told me tonight and what I'm hearing from Mr. Sinclair, or rather, Mr. Lawson, we're looking at approximately $12 million total. $6 million initially embezzled from Horizon Urban Group, plus interest and money laundered through various shell companies and investments." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. $12 million. While she'd been clipping coupons and working double shifts, David had been playing with sums that could have set their family up for generations. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Detective Sullivan opened it to reveal a uniformed officer escorting a red-faced man in an expensive suit. "Detective Sullivan, this is Jonathan Marsh, legal counsel for Horizon Urban Group. He's been waiting to speak with you about the Lawson case." Marsh entered the room carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Rachel's car. He glanced at her with barely concealed curiosity before addressing the detective. "Detective, I've brought the financial records you requested 2 years ago when the investigation first opened. If David Lawson is indeed alive, this changes everything about our case." "What kind of records?" Rachel asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Marsh opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Forged vendor contracts, falsified government bids, and dummy corporations created to siphon money from legitimate projects. "Your husband, Mrs. Lawson wasn't just an embezzler. He was running a sophisticated money laundering operation that affected federal contracts worth millions. The weight of David's crimes settled over Rachel like a heavy blanket. She'd known he'd stolen money, but this was so much worse than she'd imagined. This wasn't just about their family anymore. This was about fraud that reached into government contracts and legitimate businesses. "There's more," Marsh continued grimly. "After his supposed death, we discovered that several of our international clients had been overcharged for services, with the excess funds being routed through offshore accounts. The sophistication of the scheme suggests months or even years of planning." Detective Sullivan looked up from his notes. "Do you have any evidence linking these activities to the Ethan Sinclair identity?" "That's what we're working on now. But based on the timeline and the amounts involved, it seems likely that the Sinclair persona was funded by money stolen from our clients." Marsh turned to Rachel, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Lawson, I want you to know that Horizon Urban Group had no idea about your husband's activities. When we discovered the theft after his death, we attempted to contact you, but you'd moved and left no forwarding address." Rachel remembered those first terrible months after David's death, when she'd had to sell their house and move to a smaller apartment in Queens. "I couldn't afford to stay in our old place, too. Between the debts and losing David's income, I had to downsize everything. The company has been holding a settlement fund in trust, waiting to locate you. It won't cover everything your husband stole, but it should help with the debts he left behind." Before Rachel could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was a hotel security guard escorting Isabelle Thornton, who looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Her wedding dress was wrinkled, her makeup streaked with tears, but her eyes blazed with a fury that Rachel recognized. "I need to speak with her," Isabelle said, pointing at Rachel. "Alone." Detective Sullivan started to object, but Rachel held up a hand. "It's okay, we need to talk." The men filed out, leaving the two women alone in the conference room. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the abandoned wife and the deceived bride, both victims of David's elaborate lies. "I loved him," Isabelle said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "I loved him so much that I ignored every red flag, every inconsistency. My father's investigators found nothing wrong because I didn't want them to look too hard." Rachel felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. "What kind of red flags?" "He never talked about his past. Said he preferred to focus on the future. He had no old friends, no family photos, no stories from childhood. I thought it was romantic, mysterious. I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid," Rachel said gently. "You were in love with someone who made himself into exactly what you needed. David was always good at that, becoming whoever people wanted him to be." Isabelle sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs. "He was going to use my trust fund, wasn't he, to expand whatever criminal enterprise he was running. Probably, the man I married would never have stolen millions of dollars, but apparently I didn't know him as well as I thought." "Your daughter," Isabelle said suddenly. "Sophie, how do you explain something like this to an 8-year-old? Rachel's heart clenched. Sophie was supposed to have a sleepover at Emma's house tonight, blissfully unaware that her dead father had just been exposed as a criminal on live television. "I don't know. I've been protecting her from the truth about David's debts and our financial problems. But this is going to be everywhere. The media circus is going to be insane," Isabelle agreed. "This story has everything they love. Money, betrayal, high society scandal. We're going to be dissected in the tabloids for months." Through the conference room windows, they could see more news trucks arriving, their lights turning the hotel entrance into a stage set. Rachel realized that her quiet life as an anonymous caterer was over. After tonight, she would be Rachel Morgan Lawson, the woman who destroyed Manhattan's wedding of the century. "I'm sorry," she said to Isabelle. "I know this ruins everything for you, but I couldn't let him do this to another family." Isabelle was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands where her engagement ring still sparkled mockingly. Finally, she pulled it off and set it on the conference table between them. "Don't apologize," she said firmly. "You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. If you hadn't spoken up today, I would have married a criminal and spent years helping him legitimize stolen money." The door opened again, and Detective Sullivan returned with David in handcuffs, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. David's tuxedo was rumpled now, his perfect facade finally cracking under the weight of exposure. "Rachel," he said desperately as they led him past the conference room. "Please, you have to understand." "No," Rachel said, standing up to face him through the doorway. "I don't have to understand anything anymore. Sophie and I are done trying to make sense of your choices." As they led David away, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in 3.5 years. Freedom. The ghost of her past was finally being laid to rest. And for the first time since that terrible phone call about the accident, she could imagine a future that wasn't haunted by lies. The Rosemont Grand Hotel had become a fortress under siege. News vans lined the street 3 deep, their satellite dishes creating a mechanical forest against the Manhattan skyline. Reporters pressed against police barriers, shouting questions at anyone who emerged from the building. The wedding of the century had become the scandal of the decade, and everyone wanted a piece of the story. Rachel stood at the conference room window, watching the chaos below with a mixture of dread and resignation. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop for the past hour. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize, text messages from reporters who'd somehow gotten her contact information, and 3 increasingly frantic voicemails from Emma's mother asking if she should turn on the news for Sophie. "Mrs. Lawson," Detective Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "I need to speak with you about your daughter. This story is already breaking on social media, and it's going to be on the evening news within the hour." Rachel's stomach dropped. She'd been so focused on confronting David and dealing with the immediate aftermath that she hadn't fully considered how quickly the story would spread. In the age of smartphones and social media, privacy was a luxury that existed only until someone decided you didn't deserve it anymore. "Sophie's at a sleepover," Rachel said, her voice tight with worry. "She doesn't know any of this is happening. You need to get to her before she finds out from someone else," Detective Sullivan advised. "And you should probably prepare for media attention. This story has everything the press loves. It's going to be everywhere." Before Rachel could respond, raised voices echoed from the reception hall. Through the open door, she could see Richard Thornton in an animated conversation with a man in a navy suit who had the bearing of someone accustomed to handling crises. "This is a disaster, Marcus," Richard was saying to the man, who Rachel assumed was his public relations consultant. "Do you have any idea what this does to our family's reputation? To our business relationships? I've got board members calling me, asking if we properly vetted our own daughter's fiancé." "We'll contain it," Marcus replied smoothly. "Issue a statement expressing your shock and sympathy for Mrs. Lawson and her daughter. Position the family as victims of an elaborate fraud. The key is to get ahead of the narrative before..." "Before what?" Isabelle's voice cut through their conversation like a blade. She stood in the doorway to the bridal suite, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her veil discarded and her hair falling loose around her shoulders. "Before people realize we're the kind of family that throws $800,000 at a wedding without doing proper background checks." "Isabelle, darling," Patricia Thornton appeared behind her daughter, her own composure showing cracks for the first time Rachel had seen. "You're overwrought. Perhaps you should rest." "Rest?" Isabelle's laugh was bitter. "Mother, I just discovered that the man I've been sleeping with for 8 months is a criminal who faked his own death and abandoned his child. I think overwrought might be an understatement." Rachel felt a stab of something. Not quite jealousy, but a complex mix of anger and sympathy. Isabelle was suffering. Yes, but she'd had 8 months of believing she was loved. Sophie had spent 3.5 years believing her father was dead. A commotion near the hotel's main entrance drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, Rachel could see a familiar figure pushing through the crowd of reporters. Emma's mother, Linda, with Sophie's small hand clutched tightly in hers. The 8-year-old looked confused and frightened by the chaos surrounding her. "Oh God," Rachel breathed, rushing toward the lobby. "Sophie's here." She reached the main entrance just as Linda and Sophie made it through the doors, both of them looking shell-shocked by the media gauntlet they'd just navigated. "Rachel, what the hell is going on?" Linda demanded, her usually calm demeanor frayed around the edges. "There are reporters at my house asking about you and David. They're saying he's alive." Sophie saw it on Emma's phone. Some video from here showing a man who looks like her father. Rachel knelt down to Sophie's eye level, her heart breaking at the confusion and hope warring in her daughter's dark eyes. David's eyes. "Mommy," Sophie whispered. "The lady on the phone said Daddy's not dead. Is that true? Is Daddy really alive?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Rachel could feel the eyes of everyone in the lobby on her. The Thorntons, Detective Sullivan, hotel staff, and the few remaining wedding guests who hadn't yet fled the scene. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father had chosen to let her believe he was dead? Yes, sweetheart, Rachel said gently, taking Sophie's hands in hers. Daddy is alive, but it's complicated, and we need to talk about it privately. Okay? Sophie's face lit up with a joy so pure and radiant that Rachel felt her heart shatter all over again. Can I see him? Where is he? Why didn't he come home? Before Rachel could answer, David appeared in the lobby, flanked by 2 police officers. He was still in handcuffs, being led toward a side exit to avoid the main crowd of reporters, but Sophie spotted him immediately. Daddy! She screamed, breaking free from Rachel's grip and running toward him. The officers stopped, unsure how to handle the situation. David's face crumpled as he saw his daughter for the first time in 3.5 years, no longer the 4-year-old he'd abandoned, but a real child with real questions and real pain. Sophie, baby, he said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees despite the handcuffs. Look how big you've gotten. Sophie threw her arms around his neck, sobbing with the force of 3 years' worth of suppressed grief and hope. I knew you weren't really dead. I told Mommy you were just lost, but she said you were in heaven. Why didn't you come home? I waited and waited. Rachel watched the reunion with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. This was what David had stolen from them. Not just money, not just security, but the basic truth of their family. Sophie had spent years believing her father was dead when he was simply choosing not to come home. I'm sorry, sweetheart, David whispered into Sophie's hair. I'm so sorry. I wanted to come home, but I couldn't. There were bad people who might have hurt you and Mommy if I stayed. But you're here now, Sophie said, pulling back to look at his face. You can come home now, right? We can be a family again. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Thornton had gone pale, perhaps finally understanding the full scope of what David had done. Isabelle covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face as she watched the scene unfold. Sophie, Rachel said gently, approaching them slowly. Daddy can't come home right now. He's in trouble with the police, and there are things we need to talk about. What kind of trouble? Sophie asked, her voice small and confused. Did he do something bad? David looked up at Rachel, his eyes pleading. In that moment, she could see the man she'd once loved, the one who used to read bedtime stories and build blanket forts on rainy Saturdays. But she could also see the stranger who had calculated exactly how much it would cost to disappear from their lives. Yes, baby, Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Daddy did some things that were wrong, and now he has to face the consequences. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. I love you so much, Sophie, David said urgently, as if he could compress 3 years of missed bedtime stories into a single moment. More than anything in the whole world, I think about you every single day. Then why didn't you call? Sophie's question was so simple, so devastatingly logical, that it silenced everyone in the lobby. If you were alive, why didn't you call me on my birthday? Or when I lost my first tooth? Or when I learned to ride my bike without training wheels? David had no answer for that. How could he explain that he'd been too busy building a new life to remember the one he'd abandoned? How could he tell his 8-year-old daughter that he'd found it easier to let her grieve than to deal with his own guilt? Time to go, one of the officers said gently, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama playing out in front of him. Wait, Sophie said, panic creeping into her voice as she realized they were taking her father away again. When will I see you? When are you coming home? I don't know, baby, David admitted, and Rachel heard the first truly honest words he'd spoken in years. I don't know if I'll be able to come home for a very long time. Sophie's face crumpled as the reality of the situation began to penetrate her 8-year-old understanding. Her father was alive, but he still wasn't coming home. In some ways, this was worse than believing he was dead. At least death had been final, something she could eventually accept. This was a wound that would stay open, a hope that would torture her. I hate you, she screamed suddenly, the words ripping from her throat with the force of 3 years of suppressed anger. I hate you for leaving us. I hate you for lying. I wish you really were dead. The words hit David like physical blows. He staggered backward, his face going ashen, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might collapse entirely. Sophie, Rachel said firmly, kneeling beside her daughter. That's enough. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but we don't say things like that. But the damage was done. Sophie had spoken the truth that even Rachel had been afraid to voice, that there were some betrayals so complete, so devastating, that death would have been kinder than the lie they'd been living. As the officers led David away, Sophie collapsed against Rachel, sobbing with the raw grief of a child whose world had been shattered twice. The fairy tale of resurrection had become a nightmare of abandonment, and Rachel realized that the hardest part wasn't behind them. It was just beginning. The police transport van had barely cleared the hotel's circular driveway when Detective Sullivan's radio crackled to life, with an urgency that made everyone in the lobby freeze. All units, we have a situation. The suspect has overpowered Officer Martinez and taken a hostage. Repeat, David Lawson has escaped custody and is armed. He's taken Isabelle Thornton as a hostage. Rachel's blood turned to ice. What do you mean he's taken Isabelle? How is that possible? Detective Sullivan was already moving, barking orders into his radio, while gesturing for the uniformed officers in the lobby to follow him. The transport was ambushed 3 blocks from here. Lawson had help. Looks like he'd been planning this contingency all along. Through the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows, Rachel could see the chaos erupting on the street below. Police cars were screaming past, their sirens wailing like banshees, while news helicopters appeared overhead like mechanical vultures drawn to carnage. Where's my daughter? Richard Thornton's voice cut through the commotion, his usual composure completely shattered. Where the hell is Isabelle? Sir, we're tracking them now, Sullivan replied, pressing his earpiece closer as updates poured in. They're in a silver BMW heading south on Park Avenue. We have units converging from all directions. Sophie pressed closer to Rachel, her small body trembling. Mommy, is Daddy really bad? Did he hurt someone? Rachel wrapped her arms around her daughter, trying to shield her from the adult horror unfolding around them. I don't know, baby. I hope not. But even as she said it, Rachel knew David had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Taking Isabelle hostage wasn't the act of a man seeking redemption. It was the desperate move of someone with nothing left to lose. Mrs. Lawson? Detective Sullivan said, approaching her with his phone in hand. I need you to think. Where would David go? Is there anywhere that would have special meaning to him? Somewhere he might think he could hide or make a last stand? Rachel's mind raced through their shared history, trying to think like the man she'd once known. The bridge, she said suddenly. Evergreen Crossing Bridge. That's where he supposedly died. He might think there's some kind of poetic justice in going back there. Sullivan nodded grimly and relayed the information to his units. All cars. Suspect may be heading toward Evergreen Crossing Bridge. Approach with extreme caution. Hostage situation remains in effect. Patricia Thornton had gone white as parchment, clutching a handkerchief that bore her family's monogram. This is our fault, she whispered. We should have investigated more thoroughly. We should have protected her. No, Rachel said firmly. This is David's fault, no one else's. He made these choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. But even as she spoke, Rachel felt the weight of her own decision to expose David publicly. If she'd gone to the police privately, if she'd found another way to reveal the truth, would Isabelle be safe right now? The thought that her quest for justice might have put an innocent woman in danger gnawed at her conscience. Linda had taken Sophie to a quiet corner of the lobby, trying to distract her with games on her phone. But Rachel could see her daughter's eyes constantly darting toward the adults and their urgent conversations. Sophie was 8, not stupid. She understood that something terrible was happening. Detective Sullivan, one of the uniformed officers, called out. We've got eyes on the vehicle. They're on the FDR Drive heading toward the bridge, but traffic is backing up. Looks like Lawson's trapped. Sullivan's jaw tightened. What's his tactical situation? He's boxed in by construction traffic ahead and our units behind, but he's got the hostage and witnesses report seeing him with what appears to be a handgun. Rachel's heart pounded. A gun. David had a gun, and he was desperate enough to use it. She thought of Isabelle. Young, innocent Isabelle who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love with a phantom. I need to be there, Rachel said suddenly. If David's cornered, if he's making desperate decisions, maybe I can talk to him. Maybe I can get him to let her go. Absolutely not, Sullivan replied immediately. Mrs. Lawson, I understand your concern, but this is a police matter now. Lawson is armed and desperate. Putting more civilians in danger isn't going to help anyone. I'm not just any civilian, Rachel insisted. I'm his wife. I know him better than anyone. I know what he's thinking, how he reacts when he's scared. Richard Thornton stepped forward, his face etched with a father's desperation. Detective, if there's any chance Mrs. Lawson could help get my daughter back safely, shouldn't we consider it? Sullivan looked between them, clearly weighing the risks. His radio crackled again with updates from the scene. David's car was now completely surrounded, but he'd made no demands, issued no ultimatums. He was simply sitting there with Isabelle, as if he were trying to figure out his next move. The negotiator is en route, Sullivan said finally. But Mrs. Lawson, if you're serious about this, you'd be going in with no guarantees. Desperate men do unpredictable things. He won't hurt me, Rachel said with more conviction than she felt. Whatever else David has become, he wouldn't hurt Sophie's mother. And maybe I can make him see that hurting Isabelle won't solve anything. 20 minutes later, Rachel found herself in the back of a police cruiser racing through Manhattan traffic, toward what might be her husband's final stand. Sophie was safely with Linda, who'd promised to take her home and shield her from the news coverage as much as possible. The scene at Evergreen Crossing Bridge was like something from an action movie. Police cars formed a perimeter around a silver BMW that sat motionless in the center of the bridge, their red and blue lights painting the evening sky in primary colors. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical buzzards, their cameras capturing every moment for the viewing pleasure of millions. Rachel could see David's silhouette in the driver's seat and beside him, Isabelle's smaller form. Even from a distance, she could tell the younger woman was terrified, but still alive. Mrs. Lawson, the lead negotiator, a calm-voiced woman named Detective Parks, briefed her as they approached the perimeter. Here's what we know. Lawson has made no demands. He's not answering his phone, not responding to our attempts at communication. Ms. Thornton appears unharmed but is clearly under duress. What does he want? Rachel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's what we're hoping you can help us figure out. Sometimes when people are this far gone, they're not looking for a way out. They're looking for a way to end it on their terms. The implication hung heavy in the air. David might not be planning to escape. He might be planning to take Isabelle with him in a final act of destruction that would ensure his name was remembered for all the wrong reasons. Rachel was fitted with a bulletproof vest and a communication device that would allow the negotiation team to hear everything she said. As she approached the police barrier, she could see David's face more clearly through the car's windshield. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man who'd finally run out of places to hide. "David!" she called out, her voice carrying across the bridge. "It's Rachel. I'm here to talk." The car's driver's side window rolled down slowly, and David's voice drifted back to her, barely audible over the wind. "You shouldn't have come, Rach. This isn't about you anymore, isn't it?" Rachel took a step closer, ignoring the nervous gestures from the officers behind her. "You spent 3 years making it about me and Sophie, making us live with the consequences of your choices while you built a new life. Now you're going to drag an innocent woman into it too. She's not innocent." David's voice cracked with emotion. "None of them are innocent. They live in their perfect world, spending money they never had to earn, never having to face real consequences for anything. And that justifies this. That justifies terrorizing a woman whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong man." Through the car's windows, Rachel could see Isabelle's face, pale and streaked with tears. The young woman was looking directly at her, and Rachel could see a complex mix of fear and gratitude in her eyes. "Let her go, David," Rachel continued, moving closer still. "You want to punish someone for the mess your life became? Fine, but it should be me, not her. I'm the one who exposed you. I'm the one who destroyed your perfect new life. You think I don't know that?" David's laugh was bitter and broken. "You think I don't know this is all my fault? That everything I've touched turns to poison? Then end it," Rachel said simply. "Let Isabelle go, put down the gun, and end it. Stop hurting people who don't deserve it." For a moment, the bridge was silent, except for the wind and the distant sound of helicopters. Rachel could see David struggling with himself, the last remnants of the man she'd once loved, warring with the criminal he'd become. Then the car's engine roared to life. The BMW's engine roared like a wounded animal as David gunned it forward, tires squealing against the asphalt of Evergreen Crossing Bridge. Rachel dove behind a police cruiser as the silver car careened toward the roadblock, Isabelle's scream piercing the air above the chaos of shouting officers and wailing sirens. "He's making a run for it," Detective Parks shouted into her radio. "All units, suspect is attempting to break through the north perimeter." But David wasn't trying to escape. Rachel could see it in the desperate angle of the car, the way he seemed to be fighting with the steering wheel rather than controlling it. This wasn't a calculated escape attempt. This was the final act of a man who'd run out of places to hide from himself. The BMW crashed through the construction barriers at the bridge's edge, sending orange cones and metal barricades flying like confetti. Police cars lurched forward in pursuit. But David had a head start, and the kind of reckless desperation that made him willing to take risks no sane person would consider. "Rachel, get back!" Detective Sullivan's voice cut through the commotion as he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the relative safety of the command vehicle. "We've got units moving to intercept, but this is out of our hands now." Through the reinforced windows of the police van, Rachel watched her husband's final desperate gambit play out in real time. The silver BMW wove through traffic like a pinball, narrowly missing a city bus and sending a taxi spinning into a parked car. Behind him, a convoy of police vehicles followed, their lights painting the darkening sky in strobing reds and blues. "Where's he going?" Rachel asked, though part of her already knew. David had always been predictable in his patterns, even when he thought he was being clever. "Based on his trajectory, he's heading toward the financial district," Detective Parks replied, monitoring the chase through GPS tracking and helicopter feeds. "But traffic's getting heavier, and he's running out of room to maneuver," on the van's main monitor. Rachel could see aerial footage from one of the news helicopters. The BMW was trapped in a maze of evening traffic, surrounded by police cars but still moving, still dangerous. She could make out two figures in the front seat. David hunched over the steering wheel, and Isabelle pressed against the passenger door as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. "Can you get me on the radio to him?" Rachel asked suddenly. "His phone, the car's system, anything." Detective Parks exchanged a glance with Sullivan. "Mrs. Lawson, I understand your desire to help, but you said it yourself. Desperate men do unpredictable things. But I know this man. I lived with him for 8 years. I bore his child. I mourned him for 3 years. If anyone can get through to whatever's left of his conscience, it's me." After a moment's hesitation, Parks nodded to the communications officer. "Patch Mrs. Lawson through to the suspect's phone, but keep it brief. We don't want to distract him while he's driving." Rachel took the handset with trembling fingers, watching the aerial feed as David's car swerved around a delivery truck, missing it by inches. "David, it's Rachel. Pick up the phone." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then David's voice crackled through the speakers, hollow and distant. "Rach, how are you? Never mind. You shouldn't be listening to this. Where else would I be?" Rachel kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You're still my husband, David. Legally, at least. And that woman with you doesn't deserve to pay for your mistakes. She's not paying for my mistakes." David's voice was bitter, strained. "She's paying for theirs, her family, all these people who think money makes them better than everyone else. Do you know what her trust fund is worth, Rachel? More than we'll ever see in 10 lifetimes. So, this is about jealousy now. About punishing people for having what you wanted. It's about justice." The words exploded from the speakers, and Rachel could hear Isabelle sobbing in the background. "It's about consequences for people who never have to face them." On the monitor, Rachel watched the BMW take a sharp right turn, tires smoking as David pushed the car beyond its limits. They were in Lower Manhattan now, weaving through the narrow streets that had been laid out when the city was still a colonial trading post. "The only person who needs to face consequences is you, David. You stole money. You faked your death. You abandoned your family. Isabelle didn't do any of that. Isabelle fell in love with a criminal." David's laugh was harsh and broken. She was so eager to believe in the fairy tale that she never asked the right questions. "Just like you did when we got married." The accusation hit Rachel like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stay focused. Through the helicopter feed, She could see that David was approaching a dead end. The construction around the New World Trade Center had created a maze of barriers and detours that would force him to either stop or make an even more desperate move. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did fall for the fairy tale. I believed in the man I thought you were instead of seeing the man you actually were. But that doesn't make me responsible for your choices. And it doesn't make Isabelle responsible for yours. She was going to marry me, Rachel. She was going to help me legitimize everything I'd stolen. Her name, her family's reputation, her money. It was all going to wash away my sins. And when that didn't work, when the guilt kept eating at you, what then, David? Another fake death, another innocent woman to drag into your mess." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of sirens and the helicopter rotors overhead. Rachel watched the aerial feed as David's car approached the construction barriers that would force him to make a choice. "There is no then," David said finally, his voice hollow. "There's no way out of this that doesn't destroy everything. Do you understand that, Rachel? No matter what happens now. Sophie's going to grow up knowing her father was a criminal. Isabelle's going to spend the rest of her life as the woman who almost married a con man. And you're going to be the widow who brought it all crashing down." "Good," Rachel said firmly. "Let it all crash down. Let the truth finally see daylight instead of festering in the dark where you've been hiding it." On the monitor, she could see that David had reached the dead end. Construction barriers blocked his path forward, and police cars were closing in from behind. He was trapped, literally and figuratively, with nowhere left to run. "David," Isabelle's voice came through the speakers for the first time, weak and terrified but determined. "Please just let me go. I won't press charges. I won't testify against you. Just let me go home to my family." "You don't understand," David replied, but his voice was gentler now, almost apologetic. "I can't let you go because then you'll be free. And I'll still be trapped. We're both trapped now." Rachel watched in horror as David's car suddenly accelerated toward the construction barriers. This was it, the final desperate act of a man who decided that if he couldn't escape his consequences, he'd make sure everyone paid the price with him. "David, no!" Rachel screamed into the handset, but the BMW was already careening toward a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour at the last second. The car swerved, as if David had changed his mind or lost control, and slammed sideways into a construction crane instead. The impact was tremendous, metal crumpling, glass exploding, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder. Steam hissed from the destroyed engine, and for a terrifying moment, everything was silent except for the wail of approaching ambulances. Then Rachel heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Isabelle Thornton screaming for help, very much alive, from the wreckage of David's final desperate gambit. The fairy tale was over, but somehow, against all odds, it wasn't ending in tragedy for everyone. David Lawson had finally run out of places to hide, but this time, his victims might actually survive the crash. 6 months later, the morning light streaming through the windows of Rachel's new apartment in Brooklyn felt different than it had in years. Warmer somehow, less filtered by the weight of secrets and lies. She stood at the kitchen counter, preparing Sophie's lunch for school, listening to her daughter humming while she gathered her art supplies for the day. Sophie had started therapy 3 weeks after David's death, the real death this time, confirmed by the medical examiner after the crash that had finally ended his elaborate deception. Dr. Martinez, a child psychologist recommended by the court-appointed victim advocate, had helped Sophie process the complex emotions of losing a father twice, of learning that grief could be more complicated than sadness. "Mommy," Sophie said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her backpack slung over one shoulder, "do you think Daddy would be proud of my art project?" The question no longer sent a spike of pain through Rachel's chest, the way it had in those first difficult months. They'd learned to talk about David honestly now, about the man he'd been before his crimes, about the father he'd been to Sophie in those early years, and about the devastating choices that had led to his downfall. "I think he would be," Rachel said carefully. "The daddy who used to read you bedtime stories and help you with puzzles. That part of him loved your creativity." Sophie nodded solemnly, accepting the complexity of having loved someone who'd done terrible things. Dr. Martinez had said it was healthy that Sophie was learning to hold both truths at once, that her father had loved her, and that he'd made choices that hurt people. The doorbell rang, and Rachel smiled as she saw Detective Mark Sullivan through the peephole. Over the past 6 months, Mark had become a regular presence in their lives. First as the lead investigator wrapping up David's case, and gradually as something more personal. "Uncle Mark," Sophie squealed, using the title she'd assigned him. Despite Rachel's protests that they were just friends, she launched herself at him with the enthusiasm of a child who'd learned to trust again. "Hey there, kiddo," Mark said, lifting her in a bear hug. "Ready for school? I heard Mrs. Peterson is finally letting you guys see the art exhibit today." Sophie had been accepted to the Greenwich Academy on a scholarship funded by an anonymous benefactor, though Rachel suspected it had something to do with the Thornton family's very public commitment to supporting victims of financial crimes. The school's art program was exactly what Sophie needed to channel her creativity and build confidence. "I'll walk her to the bus stop," Mark offered, and Rachel felt that now familiar flutter of gratitude mixed with something warmer. Mark was nothing like David, steady where David had been unpredictable, honest where David had been deceptive, present where David had chosen to disappear. After they left, Rachel returned to her laptop and the business plan she'd been refining for weeks. The settlement from Horizon Urban Group had been more generous than she'd expected, not enough to make her wealthy, but sufficient to pay off David's debts and provide a foundation for rebuilding. Combined with the victim's compensation fund and her own savings, she finally had enough to pursue the dream that had sustained her through the darkest months. "Reborn Heart Catering," she murmured, reading the header on her business proposal. The name had come to her during one of those sleepless nights when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. But instead of breaking, she'd found herself planning, dreaming, imagining a future built on her own terms. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and Rachel felt the familiar spike of anxiety that still came with unexpected communications. The media attention had died down, but she occasionally still received messages from journalists wanting to revisit the story, or from people who'd seen the news coverage and felt compelled to share their opinions about her choices. But this message was different. "Mrs. Lawson, this is Isabelle Thornton. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. No pressure, but I have something I'd like to discuss. Isabelle." Rachel stared at the message for a long moment. She and Isabelle had barely spoken since that terrible day at the Rosemont Grand Hotel. Isabelle had spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from injuries sustained in the crash. A concussion, several broken ribs, and psychological trauma that had required months of therapy. Through Detective Sullivan, Rachel had heard that Isabelle was doing better, that she'd started a foundation supporting victims of financial fraud, but they'd maintained their distance by mutual, unspoken agreement. "Yes," Rachel typed back. "I'd like that too." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Park Slope, neutral territory that felt safer than either of their homes. Rachel arrived early and claimed a corner table, ordering coffee and trying to calm the nerves that had been building since Isabelle's text. Isabelle looked different when she walked through the cafe door. Gone was the ethereal quality that had made her seem almost too perfect to be real. She was still beautiful, but there was a groundedness to her now, a weight that spoke of hard-won experience. She'd cut her hair shorter, traded her designer clothes for jeans and a simple sweater, and when she smiled at Rachel, it was with the warmth of someone who'd learned to value authenticity over appearance. "Thank you for meeting me," Isabelle said as she sat down across from Rachel. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "Why wouldn't I?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious. "Because I'm a reminder of the worst day of your life. Because if I hadn't been so naive, David might never have felt confident enough to try his con." Isabelle's laugh was rueful. "I've had a lot of therapy to work through the guilt, but it's still there sometimes. The worst day of my life was 3.5 years ago, when I got the call saying David was dead," Rachel said gently. "The day at the hotel was actually the beginning of my life getting better, even though it didn't feel like it at the time." They talked for an hour about healing, about the strange bond created by shared trauma, about the ways that David's deception had changed both of their lives. Isabelle spoke about her foundation work, about learning to trust her own judgment again, about the slow process of rebuilding her sense of self. "I have a proposition for you," Isabelle said finally, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a thick envelope. "My father and I have been discussing ways to make amends for what happened, not because we're legally responsible, but because we feel morally obligated to help repair some of the damage David caused." Rachel started to protest, but Isabelle held up a hand. "Please let me finish. We know you're starting a catering business. We also know you have the skills and work ethic to make it successful, but capital is always the challenge for new entrepreneurs." She slid the envelope across the table. "This isn't charity, Rachel. It's an investment proposal." Inside the envelope was a formal business plan that had clearly been prepared by professional consultants. The Thornton Family Foundation was proposing to provide startup capital for Reborn Heart Catering, with terms that were more generous than anything Rachel could have secured from a traditional lender. "I don't understand," Rachel said, scanning the documents. "Why would you want to invest in my business?" "Because David stole something from both of us," Isabelle replied simply. "He stole my faith and love, and he stole your financial security. I can't get your faith back. That's something you'll have to rebuild on your own. But I can help you rebuild your financial independence." The terms were extraordinary. Low interest, flexible repayment schedules, and a partnership structure that would allow Rachel to maintain full control of her business, while having access to the Thornton family's network of potential clients. "There's one condition," Isabelle added with a smile. "When you're ready to expand, when Reborn Heart becomes the success I know it will be, I want you to consider hiring other women who are rebuilding their lives, single mothers, abuse survivors, women who need a second chance to create something beautiful from the ashes of what they lost." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes as she read through the proposal. This wasn't just about money. It was about transformation, about taking David's legacy of destruction and turning it into something constructive. "Why?" Rachel asked. "Why are you doing this for me?" "Because you saved my life," Isabelle said simply. "If you hadn't spoken up that day, I would have married him. I would have spent years helping him legitimize stolen money, maybe even had children with him. You gave me the truth when it cost you everything to speak it." 6 months ago, Rachel had stood in a hotel kitchen, faced with the choice between her own safety and speaking a truth that would shatter multiple lives. She'd chosen honesty, not knowing where it would lead or what it would cost. Now, looking at the young woman across from her, scarred but stronger, wealthy but humble, offering partnership instead of pity, Rachel realized that truth had a power she'd never fully understood. It could destroy, yes, but it could also heal, transform, and ultimately set everyone free. "Partners?" Isabelle asked, extending her hand across the table. "Partners," Rachel agreed, and for the first time in years, the future felt like a story she was excited to write. 1 year later, the brass nameplate on the door caught the afternoon sunlight. Its engraved letters spelling out Reborn Heart Catering in elegant script. Rachel paused for a moment before entering her own restaurant, still amazed that this place, with its warm brick walls, gleaming kitchen and dining room filled with the laughter of satisfied customers, belonged to her. It was the anniversary of David's death, though Rachel no longer marked the date with grief. Instead, she'd chosen to commemorate it as the day her new life truly began. Today was also the official grand opening of Reborn Heart's expanded location, a full-service restaurant that had grown from her catering business in ways she'd never dared imagine. "Mom, you're going to be late for your own party," Sophie called from behind the hostess station, where she was helping arrange flowers for the evening's celebration. At 9, Sophie had inherited her father's attention to detail, but channeled it into creativity rather than deception. Her latest art project, a mosaic made from broken pieces of colored glass, hung prominently in the restaurant's entryway. Its shattered fragments reformed into something beautiful. "It's not a party, sweetheart," Rachel replied, tying her apron around her waist. "It's a celebration of community. There's a difference." The difference was important to Rachel. Parties were about entertainment and distraction. This celebration was about acknowledging the people who'd helped transform her pain into purpose, her loss into something larger than herself. The dining room was already filling with guests who represented the full spectrum of Rachel's journey. Linda sat at a corner table with Emma and her family, still the loyal friend who'd stood by Rachel through the darkest months. Detective Mark Sullivan worked the room with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place not just in Rachel's life, but in the community they'd built together. After months of just being friends, they'd finally admitted what everyone else could see, that their partnership was about more than shared history and mutual respect. Mrs. Morgan Lawson, a young woman, approached the hostess station, her hands nervously clutching a resume. "I'm Maria Santos. I have an appointment about the sous chef position." Sophie looked up from her flowers with the serious expression she'd perfected. "Mom's really busy today, but she always has time for people who want to work here. She says cooking is about feeding souls, not just stomachs." Rachel smiled at her daughter's perfect recitation of the restaurant's philosophy. "Sophie's right. Come on back to the office, Maria. Let's talk." The hiring process had become one of Rachel's favorite parts of running Reborn Heart. True to her promise to Isabelle, she'd made it a priority to employ women who were rebuilding their lives. Her current staff included 2 single mothers, a domestic abuse survivor, and a former addict who'd been clean for 18 months. Each had a story. Each brought their own form of resilience to the kitchen, and together they'd created something that felt more like a family than a business. Maria's story was familiar in its uniqueness. A recent divorce that had left her financially devastated. 2 young children. Culinary school training she'd never been able to use because her ex-husband had convinced her that her dreams were impractical. As she spoke, Rachel saw herself from 2 years ago. Talented, determined, but carrying wounds that would take time to heal. The position comes with health insurance, flexible scheduling for your kids, and profit sharing after your first year, Rachel explained. But more than that, it comes with support. We believe in lifting each other up here. As Maria's eyes filled with grateful tears, Rachel remembered her own desperation the day she'd taken that catering job at the Rosemont Grand Hotel. She'd needed the money, yes, but she'd also needed to feel useful, competent, valued. Now she was in a position to offer those same gifts to others. The office door opened, and Isabelle peered in, her arms full of flowers from her latest charity auction. Over the past year, their partnership had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Sorry to interrupt," Isabelle said, "but the photographer from New York Magazine is here. They want to get some shots before the evening crowd arrives." The magazine feature had been Isabelle's idea, a way to showcase businesses that had risen from adversity to serve their communities. Rachel had initially resisted the publicity, still wary of media attention after the circus surrounding David's exposure. But Isabelle had convinced her that their story could inspire other women facing seemingly impossible circumstances. "Maria, why don't you stay and observe tonight's service?" Rachel suggested. "If you like what you see, we can talk about you starting Monday." The main dining room had transformed while Rachel was conducting the interview. Round tables draped in white linen held arrangements of sunflowers and herbs from the restaurant's rooftop garden. The flowers had been Isabelle's contribution. She'd discovered a talent for event planning that rivaled her business acumen, and she'd insisted on donating her services for tonight's celebration. Richard Thornton stood near the bar, looking remarkably comfortable for a man whose billions could have bought him dinner anywhere in the world. Over the past year, he'd become one of Reborn Heart's most enthusiastic supporters, bringing business associates and friends to experience what he called authentic hospitality in an artificial world. "Rachel," he said, approaching with a champagne flute and his characteristic directness, "I want you to know that investing in your business was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Not just financially, though the returns have been excellent, but personally, watching you build this place has restored my faith in the possibility of genuine success." Coming from a man who'd built a $12 billion empire, the compliment meant more than Richard probably realized in the aftermath of David's deception. Rachel had worried that she'd never be able to trust her own judgment about people again. Learning to see the difference between Richard's earned confidence and David's manufactured charm had been part of her healing process. The evening's celebration officially began when Mark tapped his glass to call for attention. He'd become the unofficial master of ceremonies for Reborn Heart's special events, a role that suited his natural leadership abilities and his genuine affection for the community they'd all helped create. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying easily through the dining room, "most of us were strangers dealing with our own struggles. Tonight, we're a family celebrating not just the success of this restaurant, but the power of truth to transform lives." He raised his glass toward Rachel, who stood behind the kitchen pass, surrounded by her staff. "To Rachel Morgan, who taught us that speaking truth requires courage, but living truth creates miracles." The toast was echoed by 40 voices. But Rachel's attention was drawn to Sophie, who'd abandoned her hostess duties to stand beside her mother. Her daughter's presence reminded Rachel of the most important truth of all, that she'd fought not just for justice, but for the right to build a life worthy of the child who'd never stopped believing in her. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "are you happy?" It was a question her daughter asked periodically, usually during quiet moments when the weight of their shared history felt particularly present. Rachel had learned to answer honestly, acknowledging both the sadness that would always be part of their story and the joy they'd managed to create despite it. "I'm happy," Rachel replied, and realized she meant it completely. "Are you?" Sophie nodded solemnly, then grinned with the sudden brightness that reminded Rachel that children were remarkably resilient when given love and truth in equal measure. As the evening progressed, Rachel moved through her restaurant, greeting guests, checking on her kitchen staff, accepting congratulations from people who'd become part of her extended family. This was her life now, built on honesty instead of secrets, supported by community instead of isolation, grounded in purpose instead of mere survival. The ghost of David Lawson would always be part of their story, but he no longer haunted their future. Rachel had learned that the most powerful revenge against betrayal wasn't anger or bitterness. It was the simple act of building something beautiful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. At closing time, as the last guest departed and the staff finished cleaning the kitchen, Rachel stood alone in her dining room, looking out at the Brooklyn street where she'd chosen to plant new roots. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve her community and support the women who worked beside her. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when courage met opportunity, Rachel Morgan felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with the choices she'd made and excitement for the choices still to come. The heart, she'd learned, could indeed be reborn, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of love than she'd ever imagined possible.